Have you heard of the waste yarn cast on and cast off method? It is so easy to do, and look how simple it is to remove your project from your knitting machine. What you will need is first your project yarn. I'm going to use this Caron Simply Soft yarn. That's a number 4 worsted yarn. And then you're going to need what's called your waste yarn or your scrap yarn. And this will be in a similar weight but a contrasting color to your project yarn. So we are going to cast on with our waste yarn first. And waste yarn is just extra yarn that you have. And this is how you're going to start your project, but it's not going to be a part of your project once you're done. So we start with our standard cast on. If you would like a slower step-by-step tutorial on how to do this cast on method, I have it linked in the video description below. But we're going to cast on with our waste yarn like normal, one time around, going over and under each needle until you get back to your beginning needle. I like to start at the white needle. Next, we're going to put our yarn all the way down into our yarn holder. And then for the waste yarn, for the cast on, it's more secure. And so I like to do 5-8 rows. Once you have your waste yarn rows done, we are going to cut it and put the tail end into the middle of the machine. And I like to start now my project yarn again at my white needle. So I end my waste yarn at the 47th needle. And now we're going to start our project rows. And so we put it on like normal, just how you would add on a second skein of yarn. Put it into the yarn holder and into your tensioner. And I like to put it around my 48th white needle because I stopped at my 47th. So we want it to be like a continuous piece of yarn where we're connecting the two yarns together. The waste yarn and then the project yarn. You don't want to skip a needle or else you will get drop stitches. So now at this point, now that we have our project yarn on, we just want to crank out as many rows as you need for your project. So like an example, if you were doing a scarf, crank as many rows as you would like to make your scarf. Once all your rows are done for your project, now we can cut the end of our tail end of our yarn and we're going to put it back into the middle of our machine. Now for the cast off using the waste yarn method, we're going to get our waste yarn back out, which is our yellow piece of yarn, and we're going to put it in the middle of the machine. Now again, I like to start my yarn at my white needle. So I put it around my white needle and my project yarn ends at my 47th needle. So I put my yarn around my needle and then it's down in my yarn tensioner and holder. And now we're going to do a few more rows in the waste yarn. As this is the cast off and it won't be as secure as the cast on, I like to do a few more rows between 8 and 10 rows, just for a little extra added security there. Now here comes the fun part. Once you have as many waste yarn rows done, cut the end of your tail end of your yarn or let it run out, and we're going to crank one time around without any yarn, and then on the second time around it will just fall off of your machine, off of the needles. And it's so much easier to remove your project from the machine this way. But if you like to do the normal cast off so you can get a drawstring effect, check out my cast off video linked below in the description. Now to finish our project, we are able to close our tubes because we use the waste yarn method using a slip stitch. But you want to make sure your tube is not twisted when we close both sides of the tube. So I will show you how I do that. What we're looking at here is the cast off side of our tube, knit side facing out. And I have the tail ends of my yarn here. And you can see we have our yellow, and then we have a row of red stitches, and then a row of yellow stitches again. It's these red stitches that we are going to pick up because they are our live stitches or part of our project stitches. So I have the tail ends down at the bottom facing me, and then we have 48 stitches because I used a 48 needle circular knitting machine. So I count from the bottom where the tail end of my project yarn is, and I count 24 up to the top. Once I count to the 24th red stitch, then I get a stitch marker and I'm going to mark it, just as a placeholder so I remember where that stitch was. Next, I'm going to go to the other side where the tail end of my waste yarn is, that's the yellow yarn, and I'm going to count 24 stitches going the other way. And this is so I'm making sure I'm even, and I'm going to slip stitch down the tube flat on both sides. So I'm counting up And then I'm going to mark that 24th stitch on the other side with a stitch marker. Now, if you land on the same stitch that you have already marked, that means you miscounted. So go back and recount. Or if you have a stitch in between the two stitch markers, you missed a stitch too. So go back and recount. So zooming in here, you're going to see we have our yellow yarn. Here's our project yarn. This is the purl side. And this is the side you see when it's on the machine. This is considered the inside. So we want it right side out. And then we want to flip it out so we can still see the purl side and see our stitches. And so we have yellow, and they're sandwiched in between is this red. And the red is our live stitches. And this is what's just holding everything together. So it makes it really easy to see what stitches we want to pick up, because we only want to pick up the first row of red stitches. And you can also see another added benefit is how the red stitches are nice and tight, because we use the waste yarn to pick up a little bit of that slack, starting it or ending it with that. So now I'm going to go up to my 2 24th stitches that I have marked with the stitch markers. I have them kind of pulled a little bit, and I'm going to remove the stitch markers, and then we're going to slip stitch down our red stitches, flattening the tube in kind of a zigzag or X pattern. And I really love this for finishing for scarves, the ear warmer headband, and a lot of other projects as well. Okay, so I kind of pulled out my 2 stitches, so I have them there so I know where they're at, and I'm going to remove the stitch markers so they're out of my way. And I'm going to pick up my right stitch with my crochet hook and then my left stitch. Those are the 2 24th stitches that we counted. Now I'm going to slip stitch the loop that's closest to the hook through the second loop on my hook. So I hook it and pull it, and there's our first slip stitch. Now we have 1 loop left on our hook, which was from the left side. So now we want to pick up the stitch on our right side. So we want to pick up the next stitch and then slip stitch the first loop that's closest to the hook through the second loop. And that's a slip stitch. Now we go over to the left. We pick up a loop and pull the first loop through the second loop. And this is what we're going to do all the way down till we get to the tail end of our project yarn, picking up all 48 stitches. And you can see why now it's a really good idea to have a very bright contrasting color compared to your project yarn. So it makes it really easy to see what stitches you want to pick up. The other added benefit for having this waste yarn is it will kind of curl at the end of your project, and so now you're not getting that curl in the project yarn but in the waste yarn that we're going to remove. Now as we're picking up these stitches, we want to make sure you get every single one. If you miss one of your project yarn stitches and we remove the waste yarn, then that stitch is going to drop and that row will unravel. So you just want to be careful that you get every single one here. And so you can also count your stitches as you go down to make sure you get all 48. So when you start with your 2 that you marked with your stitch marker, that would be stitch 1 and 2. And then you can pick up the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, count all the way down to make sure you get all 48. And I'm going to keep this in real time so you can just kind of see the motion that I get. When we start closing the tube flat as we get close to the bottom, some of those stitches can kind of hide and curl in there because we're closing it up tighter. So I use my left hand to kind of pull back on the waste yarn so I can see what stitch I need to pick up and make sure I don't pick up on the second row, but it's the first row of wet red that I get. So now that we're getting down to the end here, you just want to take your time and get every single stitch. And it just makes this really nice, clean X pattern, zigzag look. This is what I use at the bottom of my sweaters as well, and it just makes a really nice, clean edge. So now here that I'm at the bottom, you can see how it's kind of rolled in on itself. So I unroll it a little bit so I can make sure I get all the stitches. And then you may need to move the waste yarns out of the way, those little tails, to see the stitches as well. So we just have a couple more we need to pick up. We're going to get that one and the one on the right. And then I think there's just one more hidden under the tail here, so kind of move it around. Yep, right there. And then if it's kind of tight, you might need to pull it with your fingers. You can pull the stitch so you can get your crochet hook under there, slip stitch it. And now to secure this last stitch, we want to take the tail end of our project yarn and slip stitch it through our last loop and pull the tail all the way through. And now that tail is secure, or that stitch is secure, and nothing's going to unravel, and you can knot it at this point. After this, I like to pull the waste yarn and take a look at my stitches, and this is the pattern you should see. If you get a big hole in between there that's bigger than the rest, that means you missed a stitch, so you want to undo it and make sure you go back and pick up that stitch. But it looks like I have picked up all the stitches, everything is secure, so now we can remove the waste yarn. Now this side of the project yarn is going to be easier to unravel than the cast on, as this is our cast off side. It's just going to drop the stitches. We find the tail end of our project yarn, not the project yarn, of the waste yarn, the yellow yarn, pull it and it will just unravel and come off of the project yarn. So I'm going to speed this part up and you'll see how the waste yarn just comes completely off and you're left with a really nice clean edge. Now we need to go on to the other side of our tube and we're going to close that one as well. Now on this side of the tube, I'm going to speed this up because the exact same steps as we did with the first side. We count up both sides and mark our 24th stitches on either side, and then we're going to slip stitch all the way down closed. Again, taking your time to make sure you don't miss any stitches. Once you have everything secured, double check your work to make sure you didn't miss one, and if you did, undo the stitches and pick it up. Now because this is the cast on side, our first row has our cast on, and so those stitches are locked into place, and that's what keeps your stitches from dropping. So if we just pull the tail end of the waste yarn, it's not going to come undone, it's just going to cinch it closed. So for the first row, we just need to remove it from the loops like this. Just pull at the very end, the very last row of yarn, and pull it out of the loops, and this will make it so those stitches are no longer secured. And you just do that one time around until you get to the second row. So this just takes a few seconds to do. Get it all pulled out. And once we have the cast on removed from the loops of the stitches, after that we can just pull on the tail end of the yarn and all the stitches will drop. So I just have one more that's still connected. And now as I pull on the yarn, they're going to just drop completely, just like the cast off side. So there's no need to cut out your waste yarn or your scrap yarn for your cast on when you do that. And it all just removes very easy and you have a very beautiful, nice, clean, finished edge. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on how to do the waste yarn or scrap yarn cast on, cast off. I appreciate all your likes, follows, and I appreciate all your comments as well. Thank you so much for watching and happy crafting, everybody.